we can get started with a couple of the early announcements. And that way we have as much time as possible for the main presentation that Amy will be giving to us shortly. Well, welcome to the Road to Recovery's Species Working Group webinar series. For those who have attended before, you know what this will be like. For those who are new and just joining us for the first time, we're going to highlight a particular species today and get an understanding of what a working group is doing and what they understand about the species that they're trying to recover. And today's species is the Loggerhead Shrike. For everybody's benefit, if you would keep you're on mute for the time, your computer on mute until such time as we open it up for questions and answers, I'd appreciate it. A note that we are recording this both in English and in Spanish, so there'll be both versions that will be put on our website in the next few days, so that in case you would like to go back to it or others would like to see the presentation, it will be available on r2rbirds.org. And along those same lines, we encourage you to regularly look at the website to get a sense for upcoming events and to plan your schedule around the events and webinars, engagement sessions that we are planning. And in that light, this webinar series takes place the second Friday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. So our next one will be December 13th, and so on. So stay tuned for the species that we'll highlight in those upcoming webinars. Additionally, you may already be aware, but if you're not, we have started an engagement session series focused on private lands. And we've had a couple of them already and plans for more. So keep an eye on those future opportunities where I know the next topic will be private lands conservation for birds within the context of state agencies. So keep your eye for that announcement on our website. And also a very exciting engagement session series that is occurring to focus on future leaders in conservation and bird conservation in particular. And we've had a really outstanding engagement session in September and looking to build upon that. And shortly, if you were a part of that, you will be receiving a survey that will ask some questions about that engagement session and get your perspectives on future engagement sessions from our team. So hopefully you will tune into that in future opportunities. For those who are wanting and needing the translations, we encourage you to look at the chat for the instructions on how to get either the Spanish or the English version of this so that you're on the right channel. Our interpreter, Belin, is putting those instructions in the chat, and they're fairly easy to click on the interpretation icon and select your appropriate language. And with that, I'll introduce Quinn Carvey, who is our graduate fellow who is conducting this webinar series, and I'll turn it to you, Quinn. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Amy Chabot. Amy is the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group Coordinator. She has worked with the species since the early 1990s, when she completed her MSc researching the habitat selection and breeding biology of the species in Eastern Canada. Amy currently works as the Director of Research and Conservation at African Lion Safari, where she supports her team in developing innovative research using genomics, thermography, endocrine assays, and other scientific tools to enhance animal health and welfare. Amy is an advocate for the IUCN's One Plan approach for conservation of species at risk, working to ensure that the efforts of zoos and aquariums contribute effectively to the recovery of threatened and endangered species, such as the eastern loggerhead shrike, for which young birds produced at African Lion Safari and other conservation breeding centers are used to augment the critically endangered population in Ontario. Thank you, Amy, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Quinn, and thank you, Paul, for that introduction. And thank you to everybody who's joined us today and is listening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group and the efforts for this group over the last 10 years or so. And okay, so loggerhead shrikes are one of only two species of shrike that is found in North America. The loggerhead shrike has a broad range. It's found in a great variety of habitats that can seem oddly different, but you can actually find commonalities amongst them when you start to consider the species' basic needs. So they need to have shrubs or trees, which they use as nesting sites, but they also use them for foraging perches. They are a perch and weight hunter, and they hunt in open areas, so they need to be able to see and have grassy or open substrate where they hunt for both their vertebrate and their invertebrate prey. And then ideally, they also have impaling sites. So loggerhead shrikes are a songbird, but they have a raptorial beak. They don't have the strong talons of raptors, though, and so they compensate for this lack of talons by impaling their prey. And that's actually probably what they're best known for and has actually earned them the nickname of butcherbird. Shrike is also well known for its drastic population decline. They are among the top 10 declining songbird species in North America, and their decline has been range-wide. The species, though, isn't listed federally anywhere in the US other than in San Clemente Island, which is off the coast of California. In 2005, though, 32 different states identified the species as one of greatest conservation concern in their state wildlife action plans. In the most recent revision in 2015, shrike dropped off the lists in Maine and Montana and Nebraska, but they were added to Georgia, Alabama, Arkansas, and West Virginia, which brings the total number of states to list the species as the species of greatest conservation need to 34 states, which is 64% of the total states. So here in Canada, loggerhead shrike is federally endangered in eastern provinces. Recovery plans have been drafted for both the western and the eastern subspecies in Canada, and they are managed rather separately. Given the unabated declines, loggerhead shrike was upgraded to a status of near threatened when it was assessed by the IUCN Red List in 2017. They reassessed the species again into 2020, and the status remained unchanged at that time. So based on breeding bird survey data, the species has seen a 71% decline since the late 1960s. As shown here with eBird data, you can see a widespread decline that suggests some recent increases potentially in the prairie states and provinces. Again, you see declines have been most notable in northern migratory populations and as well in eastern populations, where the species is now absent or found only as small fragmented populations. So the species ranges from being an obligate migrant in the northern portions of its range to a resident year-round in the south. And I'm just going to take a second and start this animation playing, which you'll see. So as you see this animation of weekly abundance estimates from eBird, you can see that the wintering range of northern migrants overlaps that of year-round residents. But there are actually within this areas where migrants seem to congregate a bit more. This includes the Atlantic coast, the Mississippi River alluvial valley, and the Gulf Coast, which makes these states particularly important for conservation efforts. So reasons for the decline, the species are poorly understood despite a fair body of published literature. The table here summarizes the results of the IUCN Threats and Stressors Calculator that was completed as part of the IUCN's 2020 Red List reassessment. None of the standard metrics in the calculator were scored as having more than minor impact, and severity impact these various metrics. Overall, it's been suggested that the species decline is most likely related to changing agricultural practices. So the Loggerhead Shrike Working Group was established in 2013 with the goal of acting collaboratively and to the degree possible using standardized protocols so that we could compare results of the research among different regions and help us better understand the limiting factors for this species. The group has monthly meetings by Zoom, and we have an email listserv, and we use that to share and disseminate information, ask questions of each other, and otherwise just talk Shrike. For several years, we've also had an in-person meeting annually, and we've developed a website to increase our outreach efforts to researchers and the layperson. The working group does not have dedicated funding, but we've been able to leverage grants and in-kind support. And in particular, in light of this dedicated funding, I think that we've actually accomplished a significant amount in the past 10 years. There are several conservation challenges for loggerhead shrike. These include in particular, one, a lack of knowledge of limiting factors throughout the full annual life cycle of the species, and in the non-breeding season in particular. In particular, this is because the range of migrants does overlap the year-round residents, and you can't tell the two apart in the hand. As well, current populations are very small. This makes research quite difficult to undertake due to the intensive survey effort that's required to locate the birds. And then you have small sample sizes, which limits the inference from research. The results of research to date do indicate a fair degree of dispersal amongst populations. And in the eastern populations, there's relatively low migratory connectivity. So we lack a cost-effective and efficient method to quantify the historical, seasonal, and population connections that are required to determine how threats and limiting factors differentially impact populations, and then the scale at which the threats should be addressed. And finally, because the geographic scale of the population declines is so broad ranging, and due to the migratory population, northern populations, effective conservation is going to require us to work at multiple scales, so locally, regionally, and multinational, with year-round partnerships. So when the working group first came together, we identified a set of goals and priorities for our collective efforts, and we started with 5 distinct goals. We wanted to develop standardized protocols for surveys and monitoring. We wanted to clarify the genetic population structure of shrike in the northeastern states. We wanted to identify key habitat sites. We wanted to characterize population demographics on a regional scale. And we wanted to identify limiting factors with a focus on the non-breeding season. I'm going to briefly review our progress on each of these goals and then discuss our revised goals and priorities. So I'm going to start with standardizing protocols for survey and monitoring. And so we have actually developed a very effective live trapping method, which is targeted to the species specifically. And we have a broad-scale collaborative color banding program that facilitates monitoring and is helpful in quantifying population demographics. The color banding program is coordinated across all states and provinces, and it's followed by the majority of the working group members, even though it's voluntary. Each bird gets a 4-band combination with 2 bands per leg, which together forms a unique combination. We use a stainless steel federally issued leg band, which we denote as silver, and then 3 colored double overlap plastic bands. We strive to ensure that no 2 shrike receive the same band combination in any given year. And we have a system that rotates through regions and tries to minimize the amount of overlap where birds are using the same combinations. And we also, within the system, have developed a method to help us gather information even when we only have a partial banding combination. We've also developed a program that joins the charismatic nature of the species and the interest of birders and naturalists to collect information on the species, which we have coined the Shrike Force. Our goal is to have regional shrike forces deployed, in particular in areas where color banding has been undertaken, and then to use these volunteers to collect information from the same sites and on banded birds year-round and year after year, thereby building information on where the species can be found, their year-round population dynamics, and their habitat use. The idea was a brainchild of the Texas master naturalists who were conducting surveys for shrike in the Glen Rose area in Texas, but we've taken their original idea and we've developed a GIS app that can be used by volunteers anywhere in North America to collect data in the field. We were hoping to launch this initiative range-wide just as COVID hit, and we had to put that plan on hold. Currently, though, our hurdle is more so the fact that we don't have the capacity to launch the program broadly because we don't have dedicated Shrike Force coordinators or regional coordinators, again, or funding. So moving on to the second goal, which was clarifying genetic population structure of shrike in the Northeast. We did have a molecular genetic assessment of the species over the majority of its range. The results generally supported that of Miller's 1930 subspecies designations, which we can see on this map overlying the colors, which represent the information we got from the molecular genetic survey. It was suggested by Miller that there were 11 distinct subspecies and that shrikes, however, what we found is that shrikes in the northeastern states and provinces were previously undiagnosed and unique subspecies, which we theorize adapted to the unique alvar landscape around the Great Lakes prior to European colonization. So prior to this, the shrike in the far northeast were grouped with birds further west and collectively identified as Selenius ludovicianus migrans. But the voucher specimen for this this group came from Kingston, Ontario, and so due to naming conventions, we've maintained migrans as a subspecies moniker for this newly designated cluster, and suggest that the other birds more to the south and to the west be called centralis. So we were at the time able to use those same molecular genetic tools to help assess migratory connectivity, and that allowed us to also to differentiate among subspecies and thus migrants and residents, given that the subspecies ranges are different. It's because technology has changed. So we're addressing this by beginning to collaborate with the Bird Genoscape Project, which is a project of Dr. Kristen Rueg's lab at Colorado State University. They use feather samples collected from the working group as well as from past collections, and they are redoing the Genoscape for us using whole genome sequencing and next generation genomic methods. They're going to continue to help us to undertake analyses that better understand a variety of questions regarding shrike, including hopefully connectivity in the species and factors impacting their historical and their current distributions, as well as population trends. And so moving on to our third goal here, identifying key habitat sites. The survey effort of working group members has been particularly instrumental in developing a habitat model for the Northeast, where shrike remain in only small isolated populations. And so information from eBird and from the Breeding Bird Survey is a little too patchy to do this. So we developed a habitat suitability map using MaxEnt. That was part of a couple of student projects under my own supervision, and as well Dr. Stephen Spear at the Wilds in Ohio. We developed 12 different models and simulated the probability of loggerhead shrike occupying a site based on factors such as geology and land use. And then we combine the results into a map that reflects a gradient of potential site suitability. What I'm showing you here, though, is a binary map, and so it's the greatest likely extent of suitable habitat. We can use these habitat maps now to facilitate future survey work, which then helps us hopefully refine the model and again, better understand where the habitat management should be focused and what type of habitat management is needed. Moving on to population demographics. So we've just recently completed a collaboration with the IUCN's Species Survival Commission's Conservation Planning Specialist Group to develop a detailed full annual cycle model. They use the software Vortex, which is a tool for population viability analysis and quantitative risk assessment. The work was funded actually by Blue Earth Renewables from Ontario, and this work has helped us to better quantify full annual cycle dynamics, but equally importantly, identify limiting factors to the species and prioritize threats, as well as data gaps and where we should focus our future efforts. So this model was layered onto the habitat model. It was focused in large part in Ontario. As was noted in the introduction, this population is augmented annually through the release of birds bred in human care. And so we wanted to really understand better how we could use that one plan approach of integrating in situ and ex situ to support and recover the wild populations. But we also recognized that the range of migrants overlaps in the wintering time throughout the Northeast and these other areas. So we wanted to look at year-round population dynamics, even though our focus was more so on the Northeastern migratory migrants subspecies. So the working group members identified 14 different populations based on geography, political boundaries, threats, and just general knowledge of the species. And then from this work, which took 3 years and was actually just recently wrapped up with the report now available online, we had really 4 key results. We did sensitivity testing that showed that the most sensitive demographic rates, if you would, were reproductive success, the ratio of male to female offspring, and female survival. Recovery goals were identified through this, so we actually were able to set some target demographic rates by which we could identify whether or not we were had a recovered population or how close we were getting to that. And we also had information that better helps quantify what population size and carrying capacity would be for a recovered population. We looked at prioritizing threats across regions. And we identified key knowledge gaps, both with demographic rates as well as dispersal and connectivity that will help guide our future efforts. So with all of that, we're sort of at the point now where we're saying what comes next for us. So we've reassessed and revised our current goals and priorities. Right now, what we're focusing still is on broadly implementing the survey and monitoring to address the knowledge gaps. We feel the methods that we have, especially with the color banding program, are adequate to gather the data. We just need to work at a larger scale. We want to continue collaboration with the Bird Genoscape project. As I noted, I think that the results are going to really help us address dispersal and connectivity again, but as well help us to understand how the different population declines might be impacted by things like environmental conditions. We want to work to develop best management practices. While again, the threats to the species are not well known, we do feel that habitat is key and central. Without suitable habitat at a suitable scale, we're not going to be able to maintain the species. And so to do this, and really all of the above, we need to have on-the-ground efforts. This is really important, and what we're working toward now. We'd like to work on a state-by-state basis with NRCS and other partners. And so how are we going to go about achieving these goals? As I said, the color banding program is going to be continue to be very instrumental. We've actually gotten a lot of information about wintering ground movements, dispersal amongst populations, whether populations are resident or year-round. So the surveys, though, and monitoring to collect the demographic data after color banding is particularly important. And so that's where Shrike Forces would come in. And so we are hoping to deploy state and regional Shrike forces and improve the coordination of them to gather this additional demographic data. We're hoping to work in particular with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or NRCS, and engage with them to develop and implement the best management practices. And really what we need is to fund a coordinator. Currently, I think, as I said, I think we've done pretty good so far, but to really ramp up our efforts and to really address things on the ground, we need to have a dedicated person who can spend their time doing this day to day. And so just as I wrap up, I did want to talk about social science because that is a key area here with the road to recovery. And so I kind of put some thought into this. I will say that we're not directly addressing it in our current work plan. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't, but we aren't. We very likely need to do so. I think that social science may be of particular benefit for loggerhead shrike recovery efforts. There's a negative view of the species, again, going back to that nickname of butcher bird. There are people that just have a very negative perception of this species. We don't know the degree to which it happens, but there has been in the past persecution of the species because of the fact that it can actually catch songbirds and impale them, and people like their birds and their bird watching. But one of the really interesting things, too, that I think we need to think about is that the remaining shrike habitat is often associated with what we call heritage farming. So areas where you have mixed agriculture, you have, a few cows, you have hedgerows, you don't have great big clean open pastures and monocultures on a large scale. So I think there really is something there that we could really use to our benefit to really celebrate where you have family farms that have been in the family for generations and where they're doing more of the same, and through that have a linkage to the land. But we need to think about how we do this. How are we going to do it? Who's going to implement it? We don't currently have that capacity within the current working group. So this is an area that I'm actually quite excited. I'm hoping that we can have some conversations after this with the Road to Recovery and see if they have some ideas. And then that is all that I have to present to you, but I am more than happy to take your questions at this point. And if folks are okay, I will stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy, for sharing this wonderful presentation. Your group has accomplished a lot in its time, and I'm excited to see what comes next. We're happy to open up the floor to questions. You can raise your hand via Zoom by clicking on the React option, and then you can also post your questions to the chat, and we're happy to read those aloud. I guess I had a question while we wait for the audience to become brave. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the composition of the working group, kind of who's involved geographically, disciplines, maybe how it's changed over time.
Yeah, so we definitely have an Eastern focus, and we actually struggled a little bit with that, or considered it, I would say, when we thought about the name of the group. We want it to be the North American Loggerhead Shrike Recovery Group. I did mention that habitat varies, probably threats vary, but there's also a lot of similarities, and so we are, looking to engage partners across North America. Try nationally. We have Ontario in particular is a strong partner, but Western Canada provinces would be great to have on board. Some more representation in Mexico would be great. Within the states where we do have engagement, it's really a mixed bag of academics as well as state biologists. We have some federal government representation, some from the joint venture and American Bird Conservancy, nonprofit groups like Wildlife Preservation Canada here in Ontario. So yeah, it's really a mixed bag. We even actually have some people that are just Shrike fans. So just, the citizen scientists out there. And they really contribute to the work that we do and get so excited about it. And I know for myself, their excitement often keeps me going. So it's quite a diverse group. And I think that's one of our kind of keys to success.
Yes, amazing. So we have a question asking if you could discuss your goals for a potential coordinator.
So we're actually in the middle of discussions right now with the working group in our monthly meetings and trying to come up with a job description for that. We haven't done that. So the caveat here is that I will tell you my goals for the coordinator. So I think that we really need to have somebody that can get out there and start to talk individually, state by state, with the NRCS and talk about who they are talking to on the ground and what sort of landowners and what sort of habitat is out there. And, maybe again, dig into that social science aspect about it. Is it just that people don't know about Shrike? How can we improve our efforts and our outreach? Because it's going to boil down to the landowners and the habitat. This species in particular is found mostly on private lands. And so that's going to be, both a hurdle, but as well, I think, a benefit to us if we can properly engage. I think the strike force and coordination of the strike force would be really important. My own ideal would be to actually have a coordinator who knows how to band or would be, has enough bird banding experience where they could go out and we could train them. It's one of the things we do in our color banding program. For example, so I go out, I trained Richard Bailey in West Virginia on how to do it. He then turned around and trained Sergio Harding in Virginia, who turned around and trained somebody else. So it's really a peer-to-peer support. So if we had somebody who was, had some experience burn banding, who could actually go out and do some of the color banding on the ground and then gather the citizen science, the Shrike Force people through presentations potentially to master naturalist groups, Audubon societies, and all of that. I think that that would be particularly important. And then hopefully that person also could start to directly engage with landowners as well. It's been really fun. I've done banding for Shrike in many areas, and some of the best times I've had is when the farmer, you obviously you get permissions, private lands, and you go out there, and then the farmer sees you, and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "See that little bird over there in the tree? I'm trying to catch that little bird." And the farmer will be like, "No way." And I'm like, "Yeah, just stick around and watch, and you'll see." And so I've actually had farmers where their friends are like, "Come on, we gotta go get the cows or whatever." And they're like, "No, no, 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 I want to see this." And they see the Shrike go in, and then I had the Shrike in my hand and I can talk to them about it. And then they're a convert and they're just like, "This is the coolest badass bird ever. What can I do to help?" So I think that personal one-to-one connection would be really important.
Amazing. Thank you for that perspective. They're absolutely such a charismatic species, and I think that engagement can be really beneficial. And that also raises the important, I guess I want to highlight that we are planning these private lands engagement sessions, and the
Yep.
next one is going to be state focused. So feel free to tune in if any of these things resonate with you and your needs. We do have additional questions. So could you talk more about the color banding program? Is there a region or subspecies that has a greater representation in color banded birds?
Again, we definitely have a bit of a bias based on our working group members. We have a pretty strong program in Texas. We've got several different banders there. And so we actually work. So I coordinate every year about this time of year. We designate band combinations for particular banders. So I make sure that in Texas, where we've had up to, I think, 4 different banders working in different regions, we make sure that they have their own combinations and that they don't use others. The Northeast again is and the East in general is where we tend to have people out there on the ground, mostly state biologists. But Arkansas, there's a Dr. Thon Bose and his student M. Donahue. I was looking for names here to see if they were on. They have been using the color banding as well. So they've got a kind of a long-standing thing there. And then in Ontario, we've been using color banding since 1999, actually, for our population. And so, again, what we try and do, it's 4 color bands. The color that's over the silver band, over or below the silver band, we call our year color. And that's the way that even if you just get a partial band recite, you can at least identify when that bird was first banded and get some idea of how old it was or how old it is. The full band combination is needed to help you figure out dispersal movements, site fidelity, and all of that. And then we even have a little bit of an innovation where whether the color band is over or below the silver band here in Ontario designates whether the bird is captive bred origin or a wild origin bird. So again, just even with a partial recite, we can start to quantify the impact of our augmentation efforts.
Great. And how certain is the working group that different populations of loggerhead shrike are obligatory migratory or resident? Is there evidence for any partially migratory populations and whether this may shift between years?
Good point. Okay, you caught me out there. So we have all of the above. We have year-round residents, which are the more southern areas, and then we definitely have obligate migrants, which are the Canadian areas. But in between, there are partial migrants, and so there is kind of a band. This is actually what I focused my PhD on. There is a band area where there are partial migrants around Indiana. We don't have a lot of shrike left over more to the east of there, and we are trying to figure out more about what goes on with them. The Indiana State biologist goes out there and monitors through the winter, and because they actually ban fledglings and nestlings there, they can actually tell within a clutch if some birds stay and some birds go. Um, and then I actually have a PhD student working at Queen's University who's trying to look at the underlying genomic basis for migration. And we're hoping to help change our management of the captive population. For example, if environment is impacting the reason that birds stay or go, then potentially we could use founders from Ontario, an obligate migrant population, but maybe reintroduce or augment further south where the birds would be more partially migrant. So we know that we have we have the full range of spectrum of birds doing different things here. It's based on color banding. It's also based on a pretty extensive molecular genetic study.
Very interesting. And is it useful to color band in areas where we don't have a dedicated group of people or technicians to invest in the time and effort for resighting?
So I'd say yes. In that case, maybe just banding, not color banding. I'm always really cognizant of when I have a bird in hand and what I'm doing to it. But so there's survey effort that goes into it, which is important. So if somebody is willing to go out there and resurvey and just simply band, we would be gathering information then on site fidelity, as well as simply is that site occupied by a banded bird, an unbanded bird? When you have the bird in hand, though, you can get information on their age. So we can tell based on molt patterns if they're in their first breeding season or greater. And then really also is the fact that we can collect samples. We pluck two tail feathers. Those go to the Bird Genoscape project. And then you can start to assess things over time, like effective population size, population turnover, and then contribute to the larger research studies. So, I think that there is definitely information that would be gathered by having a bird in hand. And just doing a silver band. But the color banding really would give us some really unique, like actually break down age structure in these birds and actually understand dispersal on the scale that it's happening.
Great, thank you. What do the most sensitive demographic rates tell you about best management and conservation actions to try first?
There's a way to make more female shrikes. That's what we need to do. So Shrike actually, so my master's was looking at reproductive success and habitat choice in loggerhead shrikes in Ontario and Quebec. At the time, we were finding that they were actually really successful in the number of fledgling that they had. But it really does boil down to can you do things then that provide them with nest sites that are dense and protective? Because that is one thing that we found is that they do prefer the more basically the nastier the bush, the more the shrikes like it. So hawthorns, they love those, red cedars, and those are protective sites for them, which I think contributes to their to the reproductive success. So anything that we can do to give them greater choice of nest sites that are going to improve good, suitable, super nasty, hawthorn tree or something to nest in will be really useful. And then as well, when the young fledge, because we did find sensitivity to overwintering survival of the younger age classes. Again, more nest trees help provide more shelter for the young when they're still learning how to fly a little bit better, and provide them with more sites to forage from, all of that. So, I think our management practices of just more of the same would be a way to help improve reproductive success.
Great. So you're saying that it's really fun to search for their nests.
Between searching for their nests, so you have to kind of throw yourself at the hawthorn bush, and then like when you're banding them, you get chewed on. So it's really fun.
We have a question asking how you target net the shrikes.
So we actually use a live walk-in trap. And so the trap, full disclosure, was developed by my husband. So there's sort of two live walk-in type traps that are frequently used. One is a side opening door, one is a top opening door. When I was doing my research in the field, my husband was my field assistant. And so every time you'd put down a side opening door trap, the bird would end up on the top of the trap and just like would not go to the ground and find the door. So after sitting there and watching enough shrikes do that, he found a way to have a top and a side opening door combined. So the bird comes down to this, it's about a foot round trap. It's baited with a small a mouse in a small protective cage. So the mouse goes on bird after bird. The shrike will come down, see the movement of the mouse, end up on the trap, and then have a choice of either going in from the top or going in from the side. They hit a treadle, the doors come down together, and then you're off.
Wow, that sounds amazing, and also potentially useful for terns where we have a similar problem where they never want to go in the direction that you hope
Right.
for.
Yeah.
So feel free to share some trap designs too with with us.
I actually so my husband's and then we would, have them used make another batch. So I am on his case about writing up the instructions for how you put these things together. So I will happily
Amazing.
share
Yeah, it
that.
sounds applicable to other species too. We have a few comments also. For a coordinator or other Shrike practitioners, there are a host of alumni from the San Clemente Island Loggerhead Shrike program. So there's a potential resource. And also loving the emphasis on working with state biologists, which are an underutilized audience. And then we have another question asking if a coordinator potentially could work with wildlife tracking technology companies to find custom satellite or cellular tracking solutions. So far, the technology available for their size requires recaptures, for which those who ban shrikes know is a non-starter.
Yep. Yeah, you can catch a shrike once and only once. There's one area in Colorado where Susan Craig, who was the person who trained me, could retrap, but you just they're smart, really smart birds. So right now, yes, geolocators are small enough to use on a shrike, but you do have to recapture them. We do actually use MODIS tags on the birds, and so these are deployed on a certain number of the birds that we rear in our care here because we do a soft release. We have the young in these large enclosures in the field, and we can actually put the MODIS tags on them. They stay out there to get acclimatized. We can then recatch them before we let them go, make sure there's no chafing, everything is looking good, and then release the birds. So we have learned a lot from MODIS, and I think that we could learn more. Um, Shrike are a really anxious little bird in hand, and so I, personally have some hesitations about putting tags on them because you can't retrap them. But then again, the information that we're getting is really important. So if there is a way to, reduce the size, one of the great things about having a captive population is that we can actually test some of this stuff out and make sure that it's safe and that we tweak it. For example, with Shrike, tags often, when first tags were going out, the practice often was to glue them to the tail feathers, but Shrike will actually snip the antenna. So we learned that that was a non-starter by being able to put these tags on our birds here in captivity and then monitor their health and welfare. So we'd be very happy to do more of that.
And is there still value in color banding efforts in states like Missouri, where their reported global population percentages are relatively low, such as less than 5%?
I think those are areas that are particularly important, and I base that on work I've done in Northern Illinois as well as nations. For example, in Northern Illinois, I was working in the Medewa National Tallgrass Prairie, a super small population, but even looking at that, I was able to get information about population turnover and found that there was a ton of unbanded birds. So like every year I'm out there knocking, my socks off, trying to band, would get like 80, 90% of the known population banded. Go back next year, only 30% of the birds that come back are banded, but it's a small population enclosed, and they're like, where are these birds coming from? It's not in that case like, oh, it's just that it's a big population and I only managed to band a percentage of them. I thought I really was getting the majority of the birds. And then interesting things came out too in terms of starting to look at whether it was males or females, and that particular population looked for some reason as if the younger male shrikes were actually the kind of the limiting factor there. So I actually think that we can almost get more critical information from some of those really small populations that are isolated that aren't kind of part of the bigger, in part just because this bird does seem to disperse. If you go look at the banding records and dispersal, they have some very broad dispersal movements, which might be linked to the fact they have a very dynamic nature of their habitat. It's not a stable habitat. Probably historically it was maintained by fire. And so I think that maybe they need to have an innate dispersal capacity to keep always finding suitable habitat as it changes. I'm sorry, I'm missing the chat, but I just feel like there's so much there. I see some links are coming up and stuff too. So anyway, and thank you, Tim. I saw you just did one, and yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, it looks like there's some potential to try and use mechanical bugs or grasshoppers for baiting the traps.
I have tried mechanical bugs, and I actually have sewn. I like went to the pet store and bought a little cat toy with fake fur and sewed it onto a little hex bug that was my son's toy, and the Shrike were just like, yeah, no. So, but the big grasshoppers, if you have them, that probably would work really well. Shrike do get in the breeding season kind of fussy about, like they want a nice small mouse because they've got all these insects out there that are not going to turn around and try and bite them. And female shrikes in particular, I have seen like a female come in and like just sit there to trap and wait for the male to come, and then she's like, okay, this is your duty now, you go in there and catch it. So they can be a little bit tricky, because vertebrates are, I mean, this is a small bird, and a vertebrate is, they're predators as much as they actually are prey as well, to a lot of things.
We have another question asking what years you were banding loggerhead shrike and midwin.
uh oh gosh. Okay, caveat, I'm old and my brain is like Swiss cheese. I started in about 2004, and I continued to about 2017 or 18. And the reason that I stopped was that the population basically blipped out. So there were no more birds.
We have another question asking if the species reproduces in Canada and spends the winter in Mexico, where they are from, and does the species have a migratory route to get to its site?
So the molecular genetic work I did actually also looked at stable isotopes, and then there was some additional work done by a master student, Guillermo Perez, from Saskatchewan, I believe, working with Dr. Keith Hobson in stable isotopes. And so between those two studies, we did find that eastern populations and subspecies have very weak migratory connectivity, but the Excubitarides subspecies, which is the one found in western states and prairies, actually has a longer migration distance and seems to have stronger migratory connectivity. There is some suggestion from what we know about the genetic architecture underlying migration that the longer a bird migrates, the more ingrained its migratory distance and route are. So they're more hardwired the further that they go. So the fact that eastern birds don't migrate very far could kind of be part of that. They're more like nomadic wandering. The western birds, though, go further, and so they have a little bit stronger connectivity. I don't, we haven't quantified migratory routes, but we have definitely found out that Gulf Coast of Texas is a very important area for them, and then throughout all of Mexico. But even within Mexico, there are some areas where they seem to have more migrants than residents. So there's kind of these hot spots, I call them.
Great. That's currently the end of the questions that have been posted in the chat. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. And I love this active question period. And turn it back over to Paul for closing remarks.
Oh, well, I have a question first, and I was going to wait till all the participants had one. Amy, would you kind of talk a little bit? What you've touched on the great work on the biological side and also on the social science. I'm interested in hearing about the functioning of the working group and how it currently is functioning, and frequency of meetings, et cetera, et cetera.
Um, so I admit I'm a little bit guilty because I am the coordinator, but I feel that the working group is in more of a survive than a thrive mode now. But I probably shouldn't be. I mean, I do look back and I think that we have done a lot. So we have monthly Zoom meetings that have, pretty decent attendance to them. Um, and those are really, really helpful. Um, we have found a few resources, just like having like a Google Drive where we have our banding combinations there, and we have a banding manual for the species. The yearly meetings, we started those by tacking them on to existing meetings where we knew that most of the partners would go because funding is always a challenge. So Partners in Flight had some meetings where we were able to just like tack a day onto it and people could come. Now we have annual meetings that are standalone. Usually in the fall, there's a lot of meetings out there for people, and those standalone in-person meetings, now they're hybrid meetings, are really, really important for the work planning and what we do. So yeah, that's yeah, a little bit of how we function. Listserv is important. I don't think it's overly onerous. Other people have told me we're pretty active and they get a lot of emails, but just being able to, especially because of the trapping and banding, being able to like throw out questions, or even like there's been some years people have seen some strange diseases and infections, and so it's kind of like a real-time portal to others working in the field as well. So that being able to connect. Virtually and asynchronously, I believe is the term, is really helpful. So I hope that answers the question, but it
Yeah,
was sort of, yeah.
it does. And the reason I bring that up, Amy, and for everybody who is on the call today, we are in the process, and particularly a couple of folks like Randy Detmers and others who are working on developing a document, a help tool, if you will, for species working groups in terms of administering and managing them, and taking some of the good suggestions from the various working groups as to what works and maybe what doesn't work in terms of their structure and practices. So anyway, I'll highlight that, not only trying to understand your working group, but to tell folks who are on the call that we hope to provide some more resources to you and your working group in the not too distant future that may help you in your functioning, and furthering the road to recovery for your particular species. So stay tuned for that. And if there are no other questions, I will close. Thank you very, very much, Amy. I think it was made a tremendous presentation, and the engagement from questions is an indicator of that, in my estimation. Quinn did a fantastic job again in doing the monitoring and questioning. So thank you all for joining us today. And I just highlight a couple of things as we close out, and that is really take a look at our website for upcoming events, and particularly the engagement sessions that we are in planning mode for continuing, as well as the webinar series that will continue. And we hope to, again, provide some additional resources on our website beyond the wheel that we've produced and some other helpful tools. So with that, I wish you all a great weekend, and we'll see you again down the road in recovery. Thank you very much.